There we go. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you again for joining tonight's Race History in Rock Creek panel discussion. My name is Tony Richardson. My pronouns are he, him, and I serve as the Senior Manager of JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives for the Rock Creek Conservancy. The Rock Creek Conservancy is a watershed organization protecting Rock Creek, and we are also the official philanthropic and stewardship partner to the entirety of Rock Creek National Park. The Conservancy's mission is to restore Rock Creek as a natural oasis for all people to appreciate and protect. We are the only nonprofit organization dedicated solely to Rock Creek and its parklands, and we operate throughout the entirety of the Rock Creek watershed with programs and initiatives in Montgomery County as well as Washington, D.C. In my role as Senior Manager of JEDI Initiatives, I have the pleasure of managing the Conservancy's series of race, history, and Rock Creek programming. The overarching goal of this series of programming is to highlight historical events and share local stories from the intersection of race and history. This ongoing series is brought to you through a partnership between the National Park Service and the Rock Creek Conservancy, and we thank our partners at NPS for their continued support and guidance. Tonight's event is titled The History of Reno City. Reno City was a predominantly African-American town and then neighborhood in Northwest Washington, D.C. that existed from the 1860s into the mid-20th century on land that is now part of Rock Creek Park. For the past few years, students from Jackson Reed High School have worked with local historian Neal Flanagan to investigate the history of Reno City. And tonight we have the opportunity to hear from a few of those students, as well as historian Neal Flanagan, and just really excited for tonight's event. I'm actually a graduate of Jackson Reed High School. It was known as Woodrow Wilson High School when I graduated from it, which, if you don't know, is directly adjacent to Fort Reno, the site where Reno City used to be located. And I was really surprised to learn about this history. As I was reading Neal's article, Neal wrote an amazing article about this. We will share links to that article. And after reviewing some of the materials and some of the research from the students, I couldn't help but wonder why I had never heard about this important facet of DC history. So in addition to sharing and talking about just the history of Reno City, what it was, what happened there, we will also investigate how we can be better about documenting and sort of sharing perhaps a lesser known DC history such as Reno City. One quick disclaimer before we begin. A lot of the views and opinions that are going to be shared here tonight do not represent those of the National Park Service. We work very closely with our friends from the National Park Service, but the Conservancy does not speak on their behalf. Only the National Park Service can do that. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Marc Minsker, Assistant Principal at Jackson Reed High School.
Thank you so much, Tony. Hello, welcome. Great to be here. I'm excited to have two students on the call who are already mentioned, Ellie and Daniel, who are here to talk about the work that we do at Jackson Reed. I'll be honest, I've been at Jackson Reed for 5 years, and as part of that 5 years that I've been there, I've seen a lot of change, including students who've graduated, they've gone on, they've done research, they've done work. So, we'll talk a little bit about that later. But we're happy to have Neal Flanagan here because a lot of Neal's research has informed our work. So Tony mentioned earlier, there was an article that came out in 2017, the battle for Fort Reno, in Washington City paper, really well researched, really well written article that Neal Flanagan wrote. And again, this was something that when I had just started at what was then Wilson High School, now Jackson Reed, this really intrigued me. And as I talked to the history teachers and I talked to students, there was some understanding of what had happened, but not enough. And as Tony also mentioned, like, how do we recognize that? And I think the other part of it, which we'll get into a little later, is how do we move forward, right? We can focus on the past. We can reflect on the past. We can make sure we document the past for all people to see, but then also what steps are we taking to move forward? So we'll talk a little bit about that later. I've asked Tony to cue up a short clip film. And this film, I should mention, Neal Flanagan's work again was very helpful in this, but the DC History and Justice Collective, so Tim Hannipole, Judith Ingram, two of the people who were involved in the name change. So, our name changed at Wilson for obvious reasons. And there was a group of people, I've only mentioned two, Judith and Tim, because those were the two who really started this organization, worked really hard to get the name change. And, this is tied into, again, the research. And so when this was happening, Judith Ingram, Tim Hannipole, myself, several students that are involved in our school in the CCC Club, which is the Community Coalition for Change, created a short video. And then we held a panel discussion featuring James Fisher, who you'll hear about. He was a gentleman whose family was displaced from the farm that they own, Broad Branch, near what's now Lafayette. We had Neal Flanagan. We had other historian on the call. And this was for the DC History conference. And so this was done during the pandemic. It was all virtual. So we created a session, and I've asked Tony to queue up just the first 10 minutes to start with. What it is a short video that gives you an overview of Reno with voices. The voices you're here, students from our school, faculty from our school, some of the volunteers from DC Justice and History and Justice Collective that, as I mentioned. So we're going to just watch this quick clip. You might need to fast forward, Tony, just a bit. I think it comes in.
A letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Franklin Roosevelt, from Mrs. Annie Harry, 4801 Howard Street, Reno City, Washington, dated September 30th, 1939. My dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm writing to ask if you can help me in any way you can. I have a home at the above address, which I have lived in for 27 years. It is not modern, but true, it is all home. My husband has been a resident of Washington all his life. 2 years ago, he was admitted to St. Elizabeth Hospital. He was home before those years, which he was sick and unable to work. I have been unable to pay my taxes as I have no support. I am very afraid of losing my home. I've been unable to sell it as condition my husband is in. Therefore, if you can confer with the Park and Planning Commission and ascertain if I can secure some relief, I will be very grateful. Mrs. Annie Harry.
Ever catch yourself daydreaming? Staring out of a window, say, maybe out of the 3rd or 4th floor of Wilson High School. Seeing something you've seen maybe 100 times, but this time, boom, it's like you're seeing it for the first time, and you're wondering, why are there fire hydrants in the middle of a field at Fort Reno Park? And you get out of the school building and you go exploring, and there are plenty of odd things in the field. Ghost steps, retaining walls, metal pipes and covers, clues that once there were people living up there in the middle of the park.
Except this wasn't always a park. Long ago, it was crisscrossed by Native American trails. Then, there was a farm the Union Army commandeered during the Civil War. Because the Army could shoot cannon from there, the highest point in Washington, out onto the roads that the Confederate Army might just use to attack the capital of the Union.
Fort Reno became a gathering point for freed black men working for the Union Army. Their families joined them there. After the Army left, black families stayed on, buying or renting lots.
And so a village inhabited mostly by black people was born on the edge of Washington. It became a town with increasingly sturdy houses and businesses, grocery stores, a dairy, 3 churches. It was called Reno City, and it was one of a series of black neighborhoods running from Cabin John to Broad Branch Road in Chevy Chase all the way past Silver Spring. They were united by family and religious ties.
Reno City was a world apart from Central Washington, which was crowded and noisy but full of professional opportunities for Black people. They moved to Washington to escape racial violence in the Jim Crow South and to take advantage of the city's educational and employment opportunities. DC was home to Howard University, and it provided well-paying, stable jobs in the federal government. Reno City was a working-class suburb, catching up to the more established and fancier Black communities downtown. They had chickens and turkeys and ducks and hogs in the backyards, pear and cherry trees and berries every spring.
In 1977, Wilson High School students interviewed former Reno City residents about their memories of childhood in the now erased neighborhood. Meet Augusta Moore and Mary Daniels, one-time neighbors in Reno City.
Mr. Ned Warren, those two were his houses.
I know he had a beautiful strawberry patch. I used to pick them.
And apples and pears and cherries.
Uh-huh, and a very good cherry tree too. But my aunt had a cherry tree. I didn't have to swipe his cherries.
Remember how it used to be?
In 1904, Reno City's own newly built school opened to educate the Black children of the neighborhood, a sign that the community was growing and thriving. Well over 300 families lived in Reno City at the turn of the 20th century, about 3/4 of them Black. Here's Augusta again, reminiscing.
When we lived in this row of houses, before I moved across the street on Denison, in this row up here was a white family named Fagan. Here was a family named Hurdle. Here was my mother's family. Here was a colored family, Thomas. Next was a white family. Next was a colored family, the Jameses. Next was white, and next was white. And everybody got along grand.
That success made Reno City a threat to developers' plans to charge high prices for houses in new neighborhoods. At the turn of the 20th century, the White Neighborhood Friendship Citizens Association was reportedly working with the DC governors to buy the land in hopes of forcing out the Black community on Reno, where, as a newspaper reported at the time, the houses are small and detrimental to surrounding interests. Put another way, the Black neighborhood stood in the way of developing exclusively white neighborhoods.
The pressure on Reno City only grew through the 1910s and 1920s. Washington city planners, realtors, and bankers teamed up with white citizens associations to formulate one plan after another for developing the Reno City area, creating a park, building a reservoir, and establishing schools. All of these amenities were intended to attract more residents to the growing all-white neighborhoods, and they were used to justify the eviction of the Black community that developers described as a financial risk to surrounding areas.
A government commission later reported that, quote, the old Negro settlements around the Civil War fort sites have been gradually whittled down. The white population, once indifferent to these hilly regions because they were too far out of town, has come to consider them highly desirable residential sections. Few colored families have been able to resist the methodical real estate purchasing agent or fight against the condemnation of their property.
One who tried mightily to resist was James Neal, an African-American lawyer who represented the Reno City community before the DC government in 1926.
They say that this is an unsightly place, that it is a blight upon the district. Why is it a blight? Simply because Negroes occupy it. They want a white settlement there. They say that this is an unsightly place, that it is a blight upon the district. Why is it a blight? Simply because Negroes occupy it. They want a white settlement there.
The government decreed razing of Reno City and the scattering of its black residents to far-flung neighborhoods began in the late 1920s. It was nearly complete by the time Wilson High School was built in 1935 to accommodate the children of the growing white population.
One of the last houses to be razed was a white house at 3827 Chesapeake Street, next to the stately stone Rock Creek Baptist Church, which was also knocked down, and right across the street from the white high school. The 5 children of the Scott family, Marjorie, Elizabeth, Francis, Patricia, and Spencer, posed behind their house, in their Sunday best, shortly before Reno City came to an end.
A similar eviction was carried out in the Broadbent Road area, where farms and other property owned by 4 generations of descendants of George Pointer, a freed slave, were seized by eminent domain to clear the way for Lafayette Elementary School.
So how did it happen that the once flourishing black neighborhoods of upper northwest Washington disappeared from one generation to the next? We've seen that there was a concerted effort by real estate developers and the local government to segregate neighborhoods. But there was also growing pressure on the national political stage to advance segregation and white supremacy in Washington, where black residents had managed to get stable federal jobs and find upward mobility.
In 1913, the new presidential administration segregated the federal civil service so that no white worker would have to answer to a black supervisor. It emboldened local leaders and businesses to institutionalize segregation in Washington. The president even hosted a screening of Birth of a Nation in the White House, the racist film that breathed new life into the Ku Klux Klan.
That president's name was Woodrow Wilson.
President Wilson led an administration that fired and demoted black workers who had found a road to advancement in the federal civil service. These racist policies decimated the black middle class in Washington in the early 20th century and fired up the segregation in housing and education that has kept many in the black community separate and unequal to this day.
John Abraham Davis began working as a laborer at the government printing office in 1882, and over 3 decades he rose through the ranks to supervise 10 other people, including 9 white workers. A month after Wilson became president, Davis was demoted and his salary cut. A year after that, he was pushed back down to his starting job as laborer. His once comfortable middle-class life ended in poverty. A century later, Davis's grandson wrote a mournful opinion editorial in the New York Times.
Wilson was not just a racist. He believed in white supremacy as government policy, so much so that he reversed decades of racial progress.
Federal and local governments devised many ways of pushing black people out of what were considered desirable neighborhoods. Redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, and the construction of highways right through black neighborhoods. You could spend years studying all of these legal and financial schemes to understand how our city became segregated by design. And then there were the racial covenants you could still find on house leases into the 1960s and 1970s, binding the buyer not to sell to people of color. You didn't need yard signs to remind people that much of Upper Northwest was for whites only.
Today, there are next to no black families living inside or around the one-time boundaries of Reno City. The Reno School, a handful of houses, steps leading nowhere, and old hydrants are all that remain of the subdivision. The affluent white neighborhood surrounding our school was built on the ruins of a decimated black community. And this school's name honors one of the men who unleashed the destruction.
Sometimes you walk by something day after day, and you don't really think about it. But one day you see it, whether it's a hydrant in the middle of a park or the name of the
My dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm writing to ask if you can help me in any way you can. I have a home at the above address, which I have lived in for 27 years. It is not a modern, but true, it is all home.
Remember how it used to be? Look at it now. Nothing but empty fields, ghost steps, a hydrant, 300 homes, 300 families, gone, gone.
Okay, Tony, thank you so much for controlling that. So I just want to first of all start by giving props to Judith Ingram, who is not on this call, but who was part of DC History and Justice Collective, as I mentioned before this, and Tim Hannipol. Welcome, Tim, who's here, part of that group that really helped us with the school name change. And it's interesting, props to Judith, because she wrote the script that you heard. We performed that for students, with students, and also with faculty members, and also with some people who have been affected, specifically James Fisher, who we'll talk about a little bit later, at an assembly in our auditorium. This was when we were still Wilson High School. So for Black History Month in 2019, we took Judith's script, we performed it live with images behind us. And then what you saw was the reinterpretation of that for the DC History Conference. So we screened that at the beginning of the DC History Conference session we did in 2020. Because we wanted to tell the story before we got into it. Some people know parts of the story, some don't. And I want to go to Neal first, because one of the hardest parts of creating this program for us for the DC History Conference was finding information. So besides Neal's City Paper article and about half a page in Chocolate City, those of you may be familiar with the book, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, besides those places, there's not a lot out there. So I would like to start with Neal. Can you talk a little bit about how you started your research on Reno, which has informed so much of our work?
Sure, Mark, and thank you so much. First of all, I mean, it's really excellent work, and I'm really glad to see, again, a younger generation of people getting engaged with it, because I would say that kind of was not something that I knew a lot about in when I was growing up there. So I grew up on 38th Street, about a block and a half from Fort Reno Park, and had kind of at some point heard, sort of through the grapevine, that there was a community, a Black community on Fort Reno Park that had been removed at some point, but that was really about it. And I'd also heard rumors about something called Belmont, which was supposedly a community of servant. It was built by the Chevy Chase Land Company to house servants out in Bethesda, Maryland. And they're both, you know, that's kind of what it is. And I wanted to find out more. And there was there was a bit of research that was done in the late 70s by something called the Neighborhood Planning Councils, which actually included Wilson's students, or maybe Deal students. And then there was also there was a very good local history written in the early 80s called, I think, Tanleytown Country Village into Neighborhood. I think the name is escaping me at the moment. So that's why I started, but it was very clear that there was and there was also the Tanleytown Historical Society, which had done some research. But the reality is that, you know, when you look at the National Park Service's studies of the Civil War defenses of Washington, they hadn't really dug into it that deeply. There were a lot of assumptions, and it became very clear that I started just blogging about it, that the story was much bigger than anyone had ever known. And you have these fascinating, incredible portrait of DC that was extinguished, particularly under Wilson, but also under his successors, as we have in Fort Reno.
And I just want to jump in for those of you who maybe joined the call late. You know, our host, Tony Richardson, graduate of Wilson High School, went through the same curriculum pretty much, though it's changed over the years. Ellie and Dan are both juniors, so you've not taken DC history yet, is that correct? Okay, so DC history does have a component where we do get into the Reno history. And I think, Tony, when you were there, did you study that?
I did. I studied DC history, but I had no idea about the history of Reno City. And it's so funny, as I was watching that video, I have spent countless hours in Fort Reno, going up to the top of that hill, watching the sun go down over DC, getting blown around by the wind because it's the highest point in DC. And when I never thought about it. And until I saw that, I was like, there are just random stairs that lead to nothing. And there's a fire hydrant that's in the middle. So no, when I went to Wilson, I did not learn anything about the history of Reno City.
And I just want to jump in and give props to the administration, not me in particular, but long before my time, the DC history components that we have where we focus on that history is really important, because I think that we know that there's injustice in the world. We know people have experienced that, but I think it's really important that students connect the school that they're in with things that happen, because keep in mind, for those of you that aren't aware, both Deal and Wilson built on property that we can, and Neal, we can go to you on this. There's properties within that area, like where maybe our stadium is, right, along Nebraska, or some of these areas. These were built under the premise that they were doing something. We're building schools, right? Of course, they're building schools just for white kids, which is something we have to recognize. But we want our students to not just think about it in terms of like where we are and what happened, but what are we doing moving forward? So that's where I'd like to just quickly go to Ellie. And Tony, we're going to go to the second clip and talk about James Fisher in a minute, but I wanted to go to Ellie and Dan. And Ellie, I'll start with you, because one of the things that we're doing, so those of you that don't know, our school, Jackson Reed, has a group, Community Coalition for Change. We do a lot of things and it's in the community. Ellie, can you talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we've done around not just recognizing Reno, but kind of looking forward positively to the future?
Well, some things that we've done is we're trying to advocate for more affordable housing within the Ward 3 area, and specifically kind of the a subsection of Reno that's kind of across the street. One of the initiatives that we were promoting was to make more affordable housing to kind of like help lessen like the gap that Reno created, kind of, if that's the way to say it. And just kind of like inform people and spread the message like within our school, so that, you know, like if you don't learn about history, you're doomed to like repeat it, you know, that kind of thing. It's about making sure people know the horrible legacy that they walk across every morning to get to school. You know,
and Ellie's being a little modest, because she's not only helping to inform our school, she's also helping to inform the greater community. So I don't know, Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that Ellie and the other students did, which was mentioned earlier at the Pepco substation?
Well, yeah, so if you drive across Wisconsin Avenue around Friendship Heights, at the Pepco substation, there are student panels that Ellie, along with other students in the CCC, have written, talking about that history of Reno City and the community that has been pushed out, trying to educate, I guess, the wider community, not just the school and the students, because there are adults that are not going to get that education that we're only now adding, who live in the area and have lived in the area for a really long time.
Also, it's kind of like a timeline. So like I did the first one, which was the Civil War defenses of Washington, which kind of is like the precursor to all of Reno. It's like it was a Civil War for, and then as it moves on, it's like Reno, what it was like, the destruction of Reno, then it's like the concerts that happen there now and kind of like what it's like now. And also another thing I forgot to mention, there's a remaining building that's on the Fort Reno property. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's where the tennis courts are, and it's right now it's fenced off completely, but it's set to be renovated. And we have met with the superintendent of the National Park Service to get a designated community space in there that would teach people who go in there about the history of Reno and what they're on.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. The Chesapeake House is pretty important and central to Reno. Now, as Neal will tell you, it wasn't one of the original houses, because I don't think it was built. The Mattingleys didn't build the house until the 40s. And
I just meant like remaining.
But you're right. It's the last remaining house structure. You're right, Ellie, 100% at Reno. And, you know, MPS has been very transparent about the fact that they want to create something there. Obviously a space that is telling the history, but the community aspect's important too, because as Neal mentioned, MPC 2 and 3, the Neighborhood Planning Council, was run out of that office, or in that space. That was their office for many, many years. And students who went to Wilson can tell you that was a collaborative space. That was a location where the students who were doing publications like, you know, not just journalism, but like fiction writing would go there. They would have Job Corps meetings out of there, right? This was like a organizing community space. And we're just really hopeful with the renovation that's being done. It's already underway, that the MPS will really hear the call for a community space. Both floors can't be used for community space because the upstairs is not ADA compliant. There's no way for everyone to access that. So that would probably be private offices, but at least on the first floor. But Ellie has been, central, along with a lot of other students, in really making sure this story is being told and getting people like Neal Flanagan to fact check. So it was great to have him helping with that. I also just want to mention this is community work, because if you go by and see them, it's at the corner of Harrison and Wisconsin, across from the Bank of America, the old Pepco substation. The designer was Lucy Pope, Wilson class of '83. The photography, then the research that was done, was Athena Angelos, class of '81. We had at least 2 or 3 other people contributing to this. And as I mentioned earlier, Tim Hannipol, who's a collaborator, is Wilson, I believe, class of '77. So, it really is a community family affair, and it's been great. I think what we want to do, Tony, is we're going to show one more quick clip from the panel discussion that featured Neal Flanagan, Athena Angelos, who was our photography researcher, and James Fisher. James Fisher's story is not centrally connected to Reno, but just up the road, what's now Lafayette was, his forefathers, great, several generations out, property and farm that was taken from him. And his story is really important. I just want to mention, this is the other thing, is that it's great to have historians come in and talk. And as Neal will tell you, there's nothing like having that firsthand information. So in that little program you all saw that Judith Ingram wrote the script for, we try to get first person voices in there. So you heard the voices of we have some letters, we have some oral histories. Those things are important. And also as important is hearing from people who have been impacted by this directly. So James Fisher, who's on here, as mentioned, is related to, and you'll hear a little bit about his grandfather's farm that was taken from him, Lafayette, just up the road from where Reno is. So do you want to roll that little clip, Tony? James Fisher has come to school and presented, and also, oh, there I am with, it's my COVID hair. I'm going to go to Judith. There we go. Because Judith, I'd love for you to introduce James. James was part of our program at Black History Month, and powerful message, and has a personal connection to this land and this property in and around Reno. So if I'll go to you, Judith.
Okay. So James Fisher is a 7th generation descendant of Captain George Pointer, who was born enslaved and bought his own freedom at the age of 19. Captain Pointer had an amazing 42-year career working for George Washington's Potomac Canal Company. Captain Pointer's granddaughter, Mary Harris, settled on Broad Branch Road Northwest, and the family thrived there for nearly 80 years until they were evicted to make way for Lafayette Elementary School and Park. And I've heard James talk about his family history at a number of meetings. The one that I really wish I'd attended and I missed was when James went to talk to Lafayette Elementary students earlier. I guess it was earlier this year, James. It must have been an amazing conversation. I know that Tim was just really moved to tears by the questions you got and the very clear.
So was I.
And you. So I'll take it away, James. One question. Did you want me to ask a question, Mark? Or okay. So I think one thing that might be an interesting framework for you, James, unless you just want to riff on whatever, would be the similarities between the settlements, say Reno City and the Broad Branch Road settlement, and the differences, like what, how much commonality is there in the destiny of the fate of the people who lived in those neighborhoods?
Commonalities. I believe that what happened was for one reason, to make housing for white people migrating to Washington to fill government jobs. so was the family village that my ancestors had occupied for so long, um, for the school, for the park. Um, I ran into a magazine written by someone who lived in the Reno area. She was reflecting back on her childhood, and she mentioned Chevy Chase Land Company regarding taking the land and to build houses, um, and pricing the houses beyond African American and Jewish people's reach because they didn't want them in the area. I was very excited, and I still am, but I've emotionally, it became draining for me to learn about the setbacks, not only in DC, but countrywide, this continent. Every time Black African Americans were set back. So it's beyond any selfish reason. I talk for, and I feel for all African Americans. All African countries has been affected by colonialism firsthand. The mentality of the people now, I can't relate to. I lived in the Washington area all my life. I've seen redlining. I know when white people take an interest, developers take an interest, and move Blacks out of their homes. Different schemes of doing it is something that, as a young teenager, I would talk to my friends about. We've seen some white people in the neighborhood regularly, so you know what's coming, or you know who's going. The idea of history has changed for me outside of my family, and a priority need for the real Black history taught in schools. I still held on to, I'm sorry for getting off topic, Jamestown as a beginning for Blacks in this country, but recently learned that we were here enslaved by Spanish people for a good amount of time. And I'm sure many Blacks think the same. We need the truth in a history book, and our children need to learn it. And it shouldn't stop here. It should begin in Africa. Pride comes with this, is a part of pride, instilling pride in our children. I didn't know Fort Reno existed. I didn't know Lafayette Park existed before I traveled my family tree. I speak for a lot of African Americans. On the surface, I'm sure the thought is, what could knowing my history do for me? But it's a grand time. There's a lot more information out here about the truth about Black history. It just needs to be consolidated, pinned, and it needs to be distributed in the schools.
And James, as a teacher, I just want to say I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's really important, James, that not only are they reading this in books, but they're hearing it from people like yourself. So that was why I know Judith and myself were so happy you were at Wilson High School to talk to these students so they could hear your voice, so they could hear your story. Same goes for Lafayette. It's really important. You know, that's, I mean, all the historians that are on this call right now all value history, right? We all love history, but you know, it's instilling in children a way for them to be in touch with that history, that Black history, as you just said. I think it's extremely important.
It's connected to our mental health. And the children are still being deprived of it. It's not only good for Blacks, but it's good for white children as well. And it should be understood. And
absolutely. James, I want to go back. You mentioned Chevy Chase Land Company, and we're not here to point fingers, but Neal, Chevy Chase Land Company seemed to be a particularly evil agent in those days. Am I wrong? Thanks, Tony. I said we can stop it because we have Neal here live and in person, virtually, so we can ask Neal any of those questions. I do want to go to Neal for a second, though, because I don't think the clip you heard of James gave you the full idea of his history. He has a really powerful element in his own personal life, and that is his history. His own personal family history was displaced, right? So as his family was displaced from this land, Broad Branch, what's now Lafayette, his family history was lost. So James didn't discover that he was Captain George Pointer's great-great-great-great-great-greats till just recently, like in the last 20 years, which is really powerful that he didn't know that, because Captain George Pointer was like a really pretty important person, at least in DC history, and also connected to George Washington. Neal, can you talk about George Pointer briefly?
Happy to. So there's a book on this. I'm not the subject matter expert on this topic. There's a book which I believe is called Between Freedom. What is the book called? Mark, do you know?
No, sorry,
okay.
I apologize. I don't have the title.
But it's a very good book on George Pointer that came out. It traces his life and some of the family's descendants. He was essentially an engineer on the C&O Canal. He started out as a boat captain.
Tim's holding it up in the corner. There it is, Between Freedom and Equality.
Between Freedom and Equality, right? This is called. So he was a free Black man in the late 18th and early 19th century. He was involved in the Potomac Canal, I believe, first, and then he became an engineer for the C&O Canal. And he's a lot of what we know is from an autobiographical letter that he sent in order to achieve, I believe, a pension. And he's, again, just one of these many figures that, you know, despite the oppression of that time, even on free African Americans, really a pretty remarkable person. And you know, anything like that, I think the reason James didn't know that, I think, is twofold. One is the really limited resources applied to African American history. That it's just difficult. It's much more difficult to do genealogy even when you have a very clear lineage of free people, for putting enslavement aside. And there's just not as much effort, although there's some a lot of really passionate people have filled the void. These amateur genealogists. There's a huge amateur genealogy community that works on that. But the second reason, I think, is also the pain. I think a lot of the history is looked over, and I think James has communicated this to me once, that I think he thinks a lot of people don't. He was sad that this history wasn't known more broadly within African American communities, but that he understands that a lot of people don't want to know what's back there. And so when we talk about this thing, it ties into how we talk about Reno, which is that we talk about Reno exclusively as this atrocity that was committed, and we talk about who's evil and yada yada. But I think before we do that, I think we owe it to these people, if we really want to honor their legacy, we need to highlight that people live lives of joy in these communities. These communities were actually very valuable as spaces of refuge and community, and people had those memories of things like strawberry fields that were sometimes get encapsulated as Black joy. I think we should talk about that first, and we should seek to understand that and bring that to the level of equality in the same way that we honor, these local histories of white communities in Tenleytown first. And then we can start to talk about, and then we don't even have to talk about, we don't have to linger on the way that was displaced, because the loss, we'll know the loss. We will understand what they lost.
Thanks for framing it. Yeah, that was a nice way to frame it. I do want to just quickly jump, if it's okay, Tony, to Tim Hannipol. Tim, if you can come on the screen, because when we're talking about honoring, because you were talking about honoring Captain George Pointer, there was a small victory, and I want to recognize Tim Hannipol from DC History and Justice Collective, because he was part of this. And what we have at Lafayette now is a small victory, and it is honoring George Pointer. Can you just briefly talk about that for everyone?
Sure. I met James Fisher and his partner Tanya. Neal will remember this. It was March 15th, 2018. It was the Ides of March. Neal was giving a talk about his article in the Reno School, which those of you who are students at Alice Steele, it's part of Alice Steele now, it's the Reno building. And there are those beautiful history panels that the Tenleytown Historical Society did. And to Neal's point, one of the beautiful projects that the students did in the 70s, I graduated in 77, the following year, 78, there were 5 students who did oral histories. And one of the amazing oral histories, because it was the 70s, they talked to folks who had lived at Reno, in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s. And in the late 70s, they were 75 and 80. And they talked, Neal, it's just what you said. They talked about what a life was there and how they went on hay rides and played in Rock Creek Park. And one girl held the clothes so the boys could go skinny dipping and the police wouldn't come. And they taught, it was an amazing, and to the point, still in the 70s and 80s, they would go back and have a picnic every year at Reno. It was organized by the Rock Creek Baptist Church, which is one of the churches there. So Neal, I take your point about honoring and elevating the stories of the families. And that's what happened at Lafayette. So I did meet James, and I said, James, I've been dying to meet you. What can we do? And so we started on a multi-year campaign to rename the park and erect historical signage. So it is now Lafayette Pointer Park. And I'll stop by just saying that I'm a member of the board of Historic Chevy Chase, DC, which is a local history group in Chevy Chase, DC, where I grew up. And we are continuing with the stories centering the descendants. And we have worked with UDC and a group of students who are doing oral histories of James and Tanya and James's family and another family who came forward, the Shorter Dorsey family, who lived next door to James's family on Broad Branch Road, and they kept pictures. So stay tuned, because on June 7th, mark your calendars, June 7th, we're going to have a Zoom event, Historic Chevy Chase DC, centering on the descendants and their stories. So we are just getting ready to go live on our website there with their transcripts and their oral histories, and it's just so to Dan and Ellie, I didn't know any of this, although I knew a little bit of it because I was on those history projects back when I was at Wilson in the 70s. And I certainly didn't know about Woodrow Wilson. And when I found out about him, oof, not good. Anyway, it's not called that anymore. It's Jackson Reed. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks to your efforts and many others, Tim. Thank you so much. Tony, I don't know how we're doing on time. We wanted to definitely save time for Q&A. So I'm not sure.
We are doing pretty well, but that is a great reminder. So audience members, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, for Neal, for Daniel, for Ellie, if you could please type those out into the chat, and then we'll be sure to make sure we address those as we get close to the end of the event. But
Okay. I was going to go to, I'd like to go on a question. I'd like to hear from several of the folks here. I mean, obviously I'd love to hear from Dan and Ellie and Neal, but how do you see the space? That is, how do you see Reno commemorated and continue to be used today, which I think is important as we look ahead. So somebody want to take that one first? Ellie, you want to take that one? Go.
Yeah, I was about to. I think how I see Reno used is I want it to still be a community space because I do think it brings a lot to the area and we can utilize that as a place of remembrance. You know what I mean? Like it's become like such an integral part of the community. And I think like what I'm hearing so many of you say on the call that you had no idea, like to educate more people and to stop it from happening again. And like bring people together in that space, you know?
Yeah.
Try to make up for what's happened.
I should mention, if you go and you walk on the path that's been redone, the nice path between Deal and Jackson Reed, there's one wayside that has some information, but I think, Neal, you mentioned that there's more coming. Is there going to be some more?
Yes. So the National Park Service is working on a new wayside that will have a lot more information. And will cover a very similar expanse of the timeline that the students produced. The National Park Service also produced a very rigorous report on Reno last year. So I think I said earlier that in the 80s or the early 90s when they did the original one, they didn't cover Reno much, but now they produced one that is excellent. And it's called like the Reno Community a Cultural Resources Study. I really highly recommend looking it up. But that is one way it will be memorialized. I'll say that I spoke to James Neal's daughter. James Neal's daughter was about 102 when I spoke to her. She died in 2017. She was very insistent that people understand the legacy, particularly of James Neal's close associate William Monroe Trotter, and to understand the work that that there was resistance and there were people standing up for the rights even at what is known as the nadir of race relations in the United States. People like Trotter, and to identify these figures and understand who was standing up, because I think there's a sense that like, well, so and so was of their time, and there are some people who are more with the times and not, and then there are people who were there, and they tended to be Black, who were standing up to racism at that time at significant personal hardship, like James Neal.
And I also want to just jump in and just say that, one of the values that I'm finding with students learning this history and also figuring out ways to commemorate this history and to remember the community, the positive side, as Neal said, understanding that this was a place of joy and this was a community we want to celebrate, not just the bad that happened, is the students have an opportunity to work with some national organizations. So I'll just put in a little plug here. Ellie and Dan have both been working with our Rotary Club, and Next Generation Peace Builders is a group that actually provides online peace training. And basically it's understanding conflict in community, right? It's like how to be solutions oriented. And so our students have been working on that around issues like affordable housing. I see Elizabeth Baden's on here. Hello, Washington Interfaith Network, one of our partners. We've gone out into the community because we realize that this community is shaped by forces that we can't control. We can understand what happened in the past, but how are we moving forward in a positive way? So, that's some of the work that we're doing at Jackson Reed. And I'm really happy that, we have students involved. As I mentioned, if you came on late, many of the students who helped with the PEPCO panels have graduated. They're off in college because this has been going on for 5 years, this work. And so, we continue to work with new students as they come in. I saw there was a question in the chat, Tony, about the PEPCO panels.
Yeah, we have a question from Kathy. How long will the panels at PEPCO substation remain there? If they have to be taken down, is there a plan for permanent placement?
Yes, thank you for that question. So we plan to have, there will be removed. There's another exhibit that's going to be coming up probably in early June. I don't have the exact date, but we're going to take those off to the best of our ability. We're going to actually have someone, remove them. His job is to put them up, take it down to try to keep them intact. And then the goal is we're probably going to put them into a space at the school. If you've driven by our school, we have a portable. We've never had a portable. Took over one of the teacher parking lots in order to accommodate the students, because we are the largest school in the district. We have 2,200 students. 30% of students come from out of bounds, which is actually really great because it keeps our school diverse. But at the same time, we are overcrowded. So the goal is to take those and put those up in the portable classrooms, because this is a new, modular space, 6 classrooms in there. There's 6 panels. So the idea is that we would move those there. Thanks for the question. Other questions?
Yeah, so we have one from Elizabeth. She said, the more I look, the more I see evidence of former communities like those in Reno City and Broad Branch that existed around DC. We also know that Jackson Reed students come from all over the city. What do Marc, Ellie, and Daniel think about continuing to explore these stories as part of the Jackson Reed DC history class?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think we need to explore these stories in a way that we can understand why this happened, what caused this to happen, and and just understanding the people behind it, because it's easy to say, oh yeah, there were houses here and then they were moved for eminent domain or whatever, and now there's a school, but you don't see or hear the voices and the faces behind those stories. And I think that's a crucial part of it, is understanding who these people were.
Adding on to Ellie, I think it's great that now seniors in the DC history class are learning about Reno City, but I think additionally, in the area, there's Alice Steele Middle School very close by. There's Murch. There's, we talked about Lafayette. I think there needs to be, from an early age, more education about that history, so we can give students the tools, I guess, to investigate more into social injustice around them, so they can be able to recognize it more often. And then also, I think, being able to think about how we can move forward from this. It's one thing to just acknowledge it, but also how we can acknowledge the negative past and turn it into something positive. As we talked about earlier, there's loads of events now that use the Fort Reno space, concerts, rallies, sometimes protests and sit-ins, to enact positive change. So I think it's important to continue that education from an early age, so people can be, I guess, better citizens in their own city.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Dan. I want to also mention, if you look on the screen, this logo right here, I should mention that one of the things we're trying to do in other communities, right? This is a symbol. This is our CCC logo that one of our teachers created for us, actually. But you may see these up throughout different parts of the community. And I'm not talking about Ward 3, I'm saying in other wards. And because people don't always realize the history around them, we're teaming up with Mapping Segregation, Sarah Schoenfeld, who's on the call. Hey, Sarah. And these are blank in the middle because what's going to be here is we're putting these with QR codes. So if you're walking down a street, say in Petworth, and you scan the QR code, it will take you to Mapping Segregation. So you can see that, wow, this block you were on for 30 years was, racially controlled, racially restricted covenants in all of these houses. Because that's the other thing, is how are we allowing people who may not be members of our school community, may not even live in our neighborhood, understand the past, right? Because, that's something that we just take for granted. We don't always think about what's happened. So I think this is another activity that, is something we're trying to do in other communities, to go back to Elizabeth's question.
Fantastic, fantastic. Daniel and Ellie, both very impressive, much more articulate than I was as a junior at Jackson Reed. I just wanted to jump in for a second and just ask you all, we heard at the beginning of this call that you actually you don't learn about the history of Reno City until you take DC history your senior year. So I'm just wondering personally, what really motivated you all to dive so deeply into the history of Reno City?
Well, personally, So I'm really interested in like urban planning and like and studying like cities. And so my first day of freshman year, I went through the club list and I found community code living for change. And I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I like. And then I started working with Mr. Minsker. And then I dragged Daniel in because we're friends. And I was like, oh my God, you have to join with me. And now he's here too. But we
Oh,
both,
and Ellie, let's again, you're being modest. Ellie also was invited by Rotary to go and be a part of a weekend. Can you just talk about that? Which again is
oh
part of
yeah,
our.
that was, oh my God, that was so much fun. I was given a scholarship to go to it's just like it's like a summer camp that they use during the winter, and it's a weekend, and they bring in all these like the peace built that kind of like leaders in activism, and they kind of just teach us how to be better citizens like of the world. And I've completed like trainings with Rotary that like it's like peace building trainings to become like a certified like peace builder. And it's all been like so eye-opening, like the different kinds of like change that you can enact, like what's a service project, what's a peace project, and I don't know, it's like really helped me in the CCC in the work that I do.
Yeah, as Ellie said, she did drag me in. But previously I really did not know
Dragged
any
willingly.
willingly.
Dragged in a positive way.
Well, yeah, because I guess previously I didn't really know anything about the history in the area. I mean, I live in Chevy Chase. I've walked through Reno maybe, countless times, thousands of times. And it's just very interesting to realize the ground that you're walking on. And I think that's what inspired me to get involved. I'd always noticed the abandoned Chesapeake House right by the tennis courts. And then when she told me about the efforts that they were trying to make to rebuild the house and display the panels there, I just felt very inspired. And I think the peace building courses are really important for young people to, I guess, just learn how to be better for the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Tony, do we have other questions?
Yeah, so we've got a question and then a comment. So last question. Thank you for this fascinating and sad presentation. I'm wondering if you all, I would say looking backwards sad, but hopeful for the future. I mean, look at Daniel and Ellie. The future is clearly in good hands. I was wondering if you all, or if anyone else, has studied the actual creation and design of the park. Give me 1 second, I lost it. Or design of the park. In my opinion, the park is extremely confusing and not very successful, almost as if no landscape architect has ever set foot in it. Has anyone documented the actual creation of Fort Reno?
Neal, that's your question, buddy.
Well, isn't that a funny question? This is exactly what I get at. So Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. set foot in Fort Reno at least 4 times in his life. And he was very intricately, and for people who don't know, he's not the most famous landscape architect, but he is the son of the most famous landscape architects in the world. He was largely responsible for the design of the park system in what's known as the McMillan Plan. And Fort Reno was actually, they had a plan for the National Mall, which is, I think a lot of people may have seen. They also had a plan for the whole city. And he actually highlights, he's believed to be the author for that portion of the text. And the drawings for that. And he actually planned for this enormous circular park at Fort Reno, which would take advantage of its high elevation. He also personally selected which lots to take. Yeah, he personally worked on the taking lines along with a man named Charles Eliot II, who is related to another member of the Olmsted firm, and certainly went to Harvard for that. The problem is that what they did is that they essentially bought all the land first before they developed any of the parkland. So there was the centerpiece of my 2017 article is this plan by Melvin Hazen to design the park. That was not followed, but it kind of gives the general sense. He had actually a pretty detailed landscape design for that. That was not followed. Olmsted thought it was bad. He actually has a note from James Langdon. You may know who that is. saying this looks amateurish. So that was not followed. It was so there was a lot of intention given to it, and it was supposed to be part of this thing called the Fort Circle. And there still are all the land for the Fort Circle, for the most part, has been purchased. So all these strips, and there's the park sites, all the different parks around DC, and there's the strips of land between it, including Fort Drive. When we drive on Fort Drive, that was part of it, and that was actually completed through the Reno, but was not actually ever was torn out in the 70s, I believe, in order to enlarge the playgrounds. Since then, there really has never been a particularly deliberate effort to plan the park. The National Park Service, in the 30s, there was a huge scathing report about how the parks were never developed. The agency was restructured. Park Service was took over from a different agency that had them before. There's been financial problems and then changes in attitudes, and fundamentally the National Park Service has different obligations than a city parks agency would. And that's certainly a question for DC statehood. The Fort Circle is a landmark. It's a National Historic Landmark. So any changes would require going through a pretty extensive historic preservation review. But I do think something is possible in the future. But I agree with you, it's not a great park.
Thank you for that, Neal. And then we had one comment here. They said that DC is putting its archives on the Van Ness campus of UDC. The archives could host and maybe maintain a Reno City exhibit.
Neal, I can say Neal spent a lot of time at DC Archives, and I think it's probably going to be, I don't know, don't let me speak out of turn, but I think it's going to be an improvement if they are moving it to UDC campus, because the facilities, the other location was like less than stellar.
Yes. So I'm happy to answer that. I'm a member of something called the Archives Advisory Group and an activism group, which is a organ of the DC Council. And I'm also been active in something called DC Archives Advocates on behalf of a lot of academic users of the archives. We actually there's a major financial. So the plan is underway to construct the archives at UDC. It's a huge improvement. It's very important. And there actually is there's an extra $30 million in the budget to account for some inflation, basically, from an appropriation that was made about 8-10 years ago, and is very out of date. So if you have a right to Chairman Phil Mendelson, if you are a DC resident, and tell him to make sure that stays in the budget, because we are ready to go. We have a great archivist. I don't know if anyone knows anything about DC Archives. It's currently in an old stable in an alley in Naylor Court down by the convention center. It is not an adequate building. It is embarrassment. It was a decent half measure made in the late 1980s, but it was never meant to be permanent. And they've been there for 30 years, sometimes not in air conditioning, and the quality of the documents are extremely bad shape. It's very unfortunate. And we talk about, like the rest of the city, there's one file that's very important. There's all kinds of files, and they're only now figuring out, quite honestly, what they have. This very, very scattered record keeping, and the current archivist is really fixing that. But one is they have this file system called the Engineer Department file, which is essentially the city manager's file before DC had home rule, and it has about 300,000 entries. Some of those entries are letters, some of those entries are 3 legal boxes long. And the entry on Reno, I did not have when I wrote my 2017 article, but it actually significantly engrosses it. It is one of the most incredible documents I've ever seen. And it has this incredible amount of correspondence from other times. I was able to reconstruct the membership of Reno's Citizens Association, of different people's houses, because they would, every time they connected plumbing, they would describe the house. The wealth of knowledge in there for particularly if your goal is to remember and identify African American communities that have been displaced, or just any kind of thing in the past. It is one of the most incredible resources DC has. There are files for Berry Farm, even before the last Berry Farm. There are huge files for Southwest before urban renewal. There are huge different citizens associations, different groups. I've seen famous people in there. I've seen people that sound very intriguing. Businesses, getting the DC archives up and running is going to create a flourishing of DC history. And we got to, that's, if you want to memorialize it, that's let's get the archives built and get it out there. Oh, and yes, they can't put an exhibit. There's not a lot of exhibit space in the current design because it is an archive, but probably the best way to get that is to get that information online. You know, that will have the best audience.
Yeah, this is all really helpful because Neal has been working really hard on a book. So looking forward to all the research coming together in one place. Thank you, Neal. Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Jennifer agrees. She says, as a family historian, any change to DC archives will be for the better. So well received. Thank you for sharing that update, Neal. I think those are all of the questions that we had from the audience. So I'll just pause here and see Marc, Neal, Daniel, Ellie, if you all have any final thoughts or anything, anything that you'd like to share just before I wrap us up for the night.
I was just going to jump in and just as a plug, you know, our school, even though we're Ward 3, relatively safe neighborhood, we've had gun violence impact our community. We've had 2 students who've been killed this year by gun violence. Wow. So we're having a rally on June 2nd. It's sponsored by our group, which is the Community Coalition for Change, CCC at Jackson Reed. It's at 3:30 on June 2nd, and it's a rally against Save Our Children in gun violence in DC. And it's not so much about how do we end gun violence, but how do we help those who've been impacted by gun violence. So it's free and open to the community. We'll have some DC council members will be there to speak. We also have a woman from Washington Interfaith Network, Ryan Nichols, who is part of Trayron Center, which is again helping those who are suffering, you know, families who've been impacted by gun violence. So that's on June 2nd. So I've just mentioned that it's not directly connected to Reno, but it's at Reno. We get permits. Thank you to the National Park Service. They always give us these permits as because we're an institution, they waive the fee. So we've done several rallies there around affordable housing. We also have collaborated with the BACC, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. Some of you may be aware down on River Road, talking about Black displacement and land loss down River Road where the Whole Foods is located. Harvey Matthews and his family, you know, that was their property where Whole Foods is. And right across the street, the Moses Cemetery is currently under construction. Storage, Cube Storage Company is building there. There have been all kinds of injunctions and court actions to stop this desecration of Black graves. So we held a rally at Reno for them last June, again, bringing awareness, but getting students involved. So, you know, come out for June 2nd, 3:30 at Reno if you can. And, you know, more great things to come as we have more students and more involvement in the community. So.
Fantastic, fantastic. And when we send out the recording of this event, tonight's event, we will also include some links to some of the things that were shared. You'll receive a link to the entire video that we showed a few snippets from. And so if I get a link from you, Marc, we'll be sure to include a link so folks can learn more about that event that's coming up on June 2nd. So thank you for sharing that. Well, I will just say thank you again to our amazing participants. Thank you so much, Marc and Neal, for the work that you are doing. I think at this very important time with a lot of things going on in the country as far as critical race theory and books being banned, everything that you all are doing to help preserve and document and share lesser known history is just fantastic. Definitely a huge thanks to both Ellie and Daniel. I think someone said it best before. I got to find it. Margie, I have great respect, gratitude for, and faith in this new generation. So clearly the future is in good hands. Thank you all so much for the work that you have done. And lastly, thank you to everyone for attending tonight's event. Again, as I said, this event was recorded, so you will receive a link to this recording. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, be sure to check out the Rock Creek Conservancy's website, where you can access a library of past race history and Rock Creek events. For instance, last September, we did a race history in Rock Creek about segregation in and around Rock Creek Park and touched on a lot of these issues with Sarah Schoenfield as a panelist. So be sure to check that out. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions on future topics for race history in Rock Creek. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you for all the students for all your work, and Marc for herding cats.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here, Neal. Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye, guys.
Great job,
Bye.
great job, great job.
Thank you.
Great job.